Well, it seems to be working. I have a new, I've got a new router, new Wi-Fi router and signal booster. Well, hopefully that will take care of some of these seizing problems we've been having. Uh-oh. Well, anybody have any questions before we get started? While we're waiting for everyone to show up.
Random question. Can you hear me?
Just barely. Let me turn up my speaker.
You're very quiet for everybody else also.
I am?
No, not you, the other student.
Okay. Your laptop broke. I'm trying something different. You have, you're trying a colander on your head. What are you trying? That I think this kind of requires some kind of computer. A desktop IMAO. He's a titch old. Okay. Oh. Yeah. Well, it you know, it still beats smoke signals or semaphore. So if you have, if you feel like you've missed anything, Prima, you can get a hold of me later. Your laptop broke. Did the cat jump on it? Did you tip a beer over on it? Not that those things have ever happened to me, ever. Not, certainly the cat thing hasn't, but yeah. This is great. Well, that happened to my cell phone once. The screen on my cell phone just stopped working, and I had to do everything blind. And of course, you're relegated to just the phone numbers you remember because you don't have a screen prompting you, which was a little sobering because I realized that I knew all of maybe a half a dozen phone numbers of anybody, including my own. It's like, what was my home phone number again? It's always on speed dial, can't see the screen, no idea. Yeah, that was a tough week. Broke down, bought a new one. The old cell phone is sitting up there on the wall in the cell phone hall of fame, or shame, as it were. I've been through a lot of them. I have a lot of trouble with cell phones. Leave them on top of the car, jump in the ocean, forget they're in my pocket, then a couple through the laundry, mud puddles. Yeah, just can't be responsible. We got 86? Is that 96?
It's 86.
Yeah, okay, I guess we're just going to give up. Somebody asked what, and this is a really good question. I can't remember who asked this, but when the Dynion, which is a retrograde transporter, versus the Kinesin, that is an anterograde, that is moving stuff down the axon toward the terminal end. When they get to the end, then what do? Since they're relegated to only moving one way on microtubule networks, how do they get back? How do these molecules just not end up piling up at their respective ends? And I thought that was a really good question. Apparently, it was not widely known until, I found a paper from 2016 that, as you might have guessed, turns out that they participate, at least one of them participates in moving the other back toward the other end. So when Dynon gets to the end in its anterograde transport, it hops on the Kinesin train and takes it back down to the terminal end, where it can resume its make another run, and so on. So they probably both participate in the transport of each other toward their respective ends, which would make a certain amount of sense. What was there? There was another question. There's something like, was there another question that somebody left hanging there that I'm blanking on? Maybe not. I think we were right about in here. Yeah, we were at the trigger zone. And we had it begun a graded potential at the dendritic end. And let's just stipulate that that it was a big enough potential, that is, enough sodium entered that dendritic end to change the voltage all the way down at the trigger zone. In that instance, at that trigger zone, well, here's the synopsis. If you have less than the threshold, you get nothing. If it's above the threshold, you will generate an action potential. And so what's going on, again, here is the graded potential above the threshold, reaches the trigger zone. Here's the trigger zone. And where exactly that trigger zone is anatomically on a neuron, of course, my current phone has been dropped. Okay, sorry. My audio has some weird interference. Melanie, can you hear me okay? I can turn off my heater if that's a problem. My Dynon is in retrograde. There's this subculture that happens on the chat that I can't possibly tap into while I'm doing this, but I appreciate the effort. Once we're in this trigger zone with enough sodium and the voltage changes enough, these electrically gated sodium channels open, and then they self-propagate as further electrically gated sodium channels get opened, and the sodium moves, more of them get opened, sodium moves, and so on. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Obviously, this axon, this whole cell, which is a very large thing, is absolutely studded with sodium channels. Now, there are also potassium channels. We'll talk more about those in a moment. A word about sodium channels and pufferfishes, as it turns out. These sodium channels, we're talking about electrically gated. We've already also seen ligand gated. So here's a ligand gated, neurotransmitter gated type, which can be opened by say, acetylcholine or norepinephrine or something like that. Hearing, sorry. Somebody check your muting, folks, if you're not muted. I can't tell where that might be coming from. But anyway, here we go. These sodium channels, utterly ubiquitous. If they don't function properly, well, really bad things can happen, as you might expect. So much of our physiology is controlled that by these responsive neurons, and they are piled with these sodium channels. And if these sodium channels were to, say, stop functioning for whatever reason, really bad things to your physiology will transpire. Two things. Sodium channels, notice that this one is depicted as also allowing some potassium ions to go out the other way. That does happen on, in particular, the chemically gated, the ligand gated sodium channels will also allow potassium ions out. It's a bit of a two-way street. Exactly why, you have to get into the details of the conformation of the actual proteins that form the channel. I don't want to quite get into it at this point. But suffice to say, the electrically gated ones tend to be very selective. They only allow sodium ions in. Here's another picture of a sodium channel in kind of 2 dimensions. You have to imagine this in 3 dimensions. That is, this is the attempt at it, which looks kind of like an alien or something. I'm not sure what that looks like. It's pretty ugly. But imagine these things is circling the wagons and making a pore in the plasma membrane, and that's here's all the proteins involved in these sodium channels. And turns out that, going back to pufferfish here, pufferfish produce this toxin. It's called tetrodotoxin, and it's called tetrodotoxin because they're the Tetraodontidae is the name of the family of fish that the pufferfish are in. And these pufferfish have a unique bacterial flora in their gut that seems to be the origin of this toxin. They're not, do they cultivate this? Is it adaptive? Yes, because just about everything out there in the ocean has learned that pufferfish are toxic. And this tetrodotoxin, when if you were to ingest even minute amounts, I mean, this stuff is a very powerful poison. Tetrodotoxin, what it does is bind to these sodium channels, and specifically it binds in this region, not that you need to know this, it binds right here and prevents them from functioning. That is, they won't open. And if your sodium channels don't open, that means that your neurons are going to be unresponsive.
Quick question for you. That was on the electrically gated channels.
Yes, these are on the electrically gated. Yeah,
thanks.
Only on the electrically. And that's what this, so NAV, that V right there is for voltage regulated on the, yeah. Thanks. And so if imagine the billions of electrically gated sodium channels on neurons in your body, and a little bit of tetrodotoxin binding to, turns out, this little domain right here. You don't need to know that, but it just binds right there, prevents them from ever opening, and the neurons are just unresponsive. And most notably, the neurons to your diaphragm, for example. So you stop breathing because you're saying, go, go, gadget diaphragm, and nothing's happening. Tetrodotoxin, apparently, pufferfish is considered a delicacy in Japan. You have to have a special license to even handle and prepare it, because the consequences of getting it wrong, that is, accidentally spilling the gut contents on the meat, or getting any of the liver in there, any of the organs, the visceral organs, which contain high concentrations of this stuff, you ingest it and you are toast. Apparently, the nuances of this are that if you get a little bit of the tetrodotoxin and it makes your gums numb or your lips start tingling, that's supposed to enhance the experience. I suppose it does, in the sense you're sitting there eating this fish, which I hope tastes really good. There isn't a lot of meat on one of these things, but presumably the idea that this may be my last meal somehow heightens the effect. Nice piece of albacore. You don't have to worry about it. You don't even have to cook it, and you'll be all right. And it's really good. So anyway, apparently, there's speculation. Dolphins are frequently seen playing with these things. They'll get find pufferfish, and the pufferfish do their little defensive thing, which is they'll pull in water into their gut with their highly distensible stomach, and they just pull water in, and they blow up like a balloon, and it makes them too large to swallow, which nobody wants to do anyway, really, because you die. But dolphins will essentially use them like volleyballs. They blow up, the pufferfish blows up rather nicely, and then the dolphins will pass them around. Some speculation, I think it's probably BS, but is that they're wondering if, and the dolphins start behaving really strangely when they start doing this. You know, they're passing this thing around like they're passing around a joint. And some of the speculation is that they're getting a buzz off of maybe minute amounts of tetrodotoxin. I don't buy it, but it sure does look like a bunch of dolphins passing around the pufferfish bong. Anyway, tetrodotoxin. Oh, more fun with drugs. So this is the action potential, and this graph illustrates the change in membrane potential along this axis here, and this is just time. And so if you're looking at one particular point on the plasma membrane, these are the changes in voltage, and labeled here, annotated with the actual events that are causing this change in voltage. So you get the stimulus at the graded end, and it finally reaches the trigger zone and causes these voltage gated sodium channels to open. So they open, the sodium comes rushing in along its concentration gradient. So the voltage, again referenced from the inside, is going way up, gets past zero, it gets polarized in the opposite direction. It's positive on the inside. And then you'll right away see this voltage start to drop. This is a very short event, on the order of 1 millisecond. So the decrease in voltage is a result of the sodium channels close. When they open very briefly. The voltage change and they go whoop, whoop, open, close, And so the sodium rushes in and then they close. But at the same time, well, just a half a millisecond later, the potassium channels open. Potassium, again, because we've been pumping sodium outside the cell and potassium to inside the cell. And you may have been wondering, why does it do that? It doesn't make any, it seems like you're defeating your electrochemical purpose here by pumping that positive ion outside and another positive ion inside. Well, there's a method to this madness, and the method is that what this allows is when the sodium comes rushing in and you get this positivity occurring now on the inside of the cell, that can result, then we have this pile of potassium on the inside. If you open then potassium channels, the potassium will leave along its electrochemical gradient just as fast. And what that does is reestablish the relative negativity of the inside of the cell. That is, it makes this action potential, this change in membrane potential, a discrete event. Imagine what would happen if you were dependent on, let's just draw it in here. What if you didn't have the potassium channels opening? You would have the sodium channels rising, they would go up, and then the membrane potential would stay up there. It would be gradually decreasing as you would have the sodium potassium pumps that are continuing to work all the time, but that takes a lot of time. You know, they're grinding away, throwing sodium back out, potassium. If it was just left to these guys to reestablish the membrane potential, it would be, yeah, okay, finally got it back down there. A far less discrete and controllable event. This is, this kind of a message is going to be very rate limited. You think about a neuron that has to speak to other neurons, and this is the packet. This is the bit, if you will, in computer lingo. This is the unit of communication, the bit, and it's discrete. And so because it's discrete, you can take one or you could create another one. And you could create 100 of them, and 100 of them would be a different message in a certain span of time than one would be. If you had, on the other hand, some kind of signal like this that's kind of mushy and diffuse and not well defined, how accurately could you communicate information across these neurons? It's painting with too broad a brush. You need a fine brush for this. And that's what this discrete action potential voltage change is all about. And so, by the way, while I'm on the subject of sodium potassium pumps, obviously, if the sodium potassium pumps don't work, you still have a problem. The thing would stay depolarized, the sodium would stay on the inside. And so if you're ever wondering what would happen if those stopped working, well, you don't have to wonder. You could just experimentally find out by eating the flowers of this plant called digitalis. Digitalis foxglove, it's also known as. In the spring in Oregon, you'll see it just lining the ditches. It's all over the place. It's introduced. It's from Europe. It may have been intentionally introduced. I don't know, because it's pretty. It is a spectacular looking thing. It's also incredibly deadly. One of the first medicinal plants out there. It's been used as medicine and probably used as a device of assassination as well for centuries and centuries. Don't let your cat eat it. The cat will be dead. Cats have a habit of eating house plants. You don't want to keep these things in your house. But what it does is the digitalis toxin inhibits sodium potassium pumps. And so it will slow the rate of repolarization, kind of like that. You'll still get this bit, but because digitalis, the sodium potassium pumps are slowed, the rate of repolarization gets slowed. And curiously, I suppose, if you take a lot of this, you die. Turns out, though, if you take just a little, and this is where the practice of this kind of chemistry, which was largely a trial and error practice, we had no theory, probably still don't, on how this poison would work. That would explain exactly how much we should take. It's all been by trial and error. Somebody's dead, oops, too much. Somebody feels a little bit better, okay. Turns out that for some pathologies, heart pathologies, digitalis is useful in slowing heart rate, which actually improves cardiac function. So a little bit actually improves cardiac function a lot, and all cardiac function ceases. So certainly some brinksmanship there in the dosing of such a powerful poison. And you think about where isn't there a sodium potassium pump? I mean, we're talking about sodium potassium pumps that probably are probably responsible for half of all the energy in your body and use in your body. And if you inhibit them, you're inhibiting a lot of physiology with this drug. Little wonder that it's deadly. Anyway, go back here, click.
When you say it can improve cardiac function, do you mean like it can treat tachycardia or something else?
Yes. In fact, that's exactly what it does. If your heart is beating too fast, which can be pathological, and especially for people that this isn't something that if you had you're having a panic attack or something like that you would want to ingest to slow your heart rate. No. This is something for if you have, and I'll talk more about it next term when we talk about cardiac function, but if you had congestive heart failure, patients with congestive heart failure, and their heart is trying to beat too fast to compensate, and it actually ends up inhibiting further cardiac function because it's trying to beat too fast, digitalis can be used to slow overall heart rate, and it gives it more time to fill. It actually starts beating more efficiently. It's a bit of a last resort thing, but again, this is a poison turned into a drug that has been known for centuries and centuries, and some observant person noticed that perhaps right before the person that they gave it to died, that their heart rate slowed and they were actually feeling better right before they keeled over. They said, hey, I wonder if we gave them a little bit less, if that might not work out. And that's called science. And still in use today because it's extremely cheap. It's extremely well understood and known how it works, the dosing we've got down. So, if you're dying of heart failure anyway, then what the hell? I mean, you might as well give it a shot. Boy, there's a lot of people had a little too much coffee this morning. If you were to ingest, what, tetrodotoxin? Are there antivenoms? No. Are you SOL? Yes. What you can medically intervene, of course. What you're gonna suffocate is how you're gonna die from tetrodotoxin. So they could put you on a respirator until the poison clears, which will eventually happen. It'll break down, your sodium channels will start to work again. But ingesting charcoal, maybe that might help it, bind it up if it's still in your gut. But once it's in your blood, there's nothing you can do.
Is that the same with digitalis? Like if you ingest it, are you pretty much, if you ingest too much, are you done for?
Don't know. I don't think there's any. I know of no. The way it affects the sodium potassium pumps. Again, there might be things out there that you could bind it up with, so you wouldn't get any more from a dose that you received that was still in your gut, or maybe still in your blood. But once it's bound to the sodium potassium pumps, it's just going to take time to finally degrade and go away. And if I don't know that, I mean, there are certainly other things you can do. Let's say it's going to stop your heart. It's about to stop your heart. There are other things you can do. A shot of adrenaline, for example, to increase your heart rate, that might compensate. But yeah, I don't know. When I'm old to mention, just give me some digitalis tea, and I'll be golden. Yeah, I don't know. Well, would it be painful? Yeah, it might not be a great way to go. I have to say, because, well, let's think about it. What would happen if you looked at this and we stayed depolarized?
Wouldn't you be suffocating, and also all of your muscles would be like cramping because they can't stop firing?
Yes. So one of the things that these neurons are doing, right, is sending signals to muscles. And the amount of neurotransmitter they use to signal a muscle is going to depend on the number of action potentials they send. And if you get down there toward the terminal end, and we have down here this situation where the neuron just stays depolarized down there, well, that means it's going to be releasing a lot of neurotransmitter to your muscles. And I imagine that there's a whole lot of muscle cramping going on in association with this. So it might not be a pleasant way to go. I mean, if you're looking for old and demented and just want to sit in your garden and check out, don't go digitalis. Heroin. I mean, there's no even second best. I mean, I've had morphine. I've heard heroin was much, much better. And if I could have a 55-gallon drum of morphine, I would. I'm not recommending this. I'm just saying, if you're going to do it, then you might as well check out utterly euphoric. You can still have a cup of tea, heroin tea. I don't know. They used to call that essentially laudanum, which is wine with opiate in it. I've never had it, but would be willing to try.
Dr. Warwick.
Yeah.
How much are the sodium and potassium concentrations changing during this event? Do you know?
Oh, good question. Like from our original 142 versus how you could calculate that, but I don't know off the top of my head. It's just not a number I keep in my head. Why do you ask?
I'm having a hard time picturing the repolarization event, because if you have sodium going into the cell and then potassium coming out to repolarize, and then the sodium potassium pumps are trying to bring it back to where it used to be.
Right.
And so I guess I'm trying to understand the refractory period, because it seems like in my mind it'd be more dependent on returning the concentrations of sodium, potassium back to what they were and less on the voltage?
Well, less on the voltage. Well, I mean, the only thing going on here is the movement of ions against or with their concentration gradients, right? So your sodium is moving along its concentration gradient, potassium moving along its concentration gradient. So all you have to do is open channels. And then you have this active moving ions against their concentration gradient, and that's occurring all the time. Those things never stop, right? So you have this undercurrent that's always driving, always wanting to drive sodium out. Of course, when you open the holes, the sodium channels, and that stuff just comes flooding in. It doesn't matter how many sodium, potassium, it doesn't matter that they're always running. They couldn't possibly keep up. And so you have this voltage increase on the inside of the cell. Likewise, when you open the potassium channels, the opposite will happen because the pumps can't keep up. So, but then once they close, and that's not shown here, the sodium channels are closing here, the potassium channels close down here. Notice this little section right here. This is the point at which where it's hyperpolarized. They call it, some people call it overshoots, some people call it undershoots, whatever. It's hyperpolarization. And the reason that happens is that we have the sodium potassium pumps working here. So at this point, turns out the potassium channels are still open. And the sodium potassium pumps are also working. And so it causes the voltage to get super negative in here. And that's in this next picture, maybe. Oh, no, I didn't give you this. And you don't, I just felt like I wasn't giving potassium channels their due here. I had shown the intimate details of the sodium channel, but not the potassium. And this is what a potassium channel looks like. It's a bit smaller, less complicated. You might be wondering how it is that these channels can be so, and these are separate things. These voltage gated sodium and potassium channels are completely separate things. And they don't allow the other ion. These electrically gated ones do not swing both ways. And for example, this is a potassium channel, and potassium channel only allows potassium. And if you were thinking it was a simple matter of the size of the ion, potassium is far larger than sodium. And so how is it we have a channel that allows the bigger one, but not the smaller ion, which is a real head scratcher? Well, not that you need to know this, but it's kind of interesting. Turns out that both of these ions, because they're positive ions, they associate with water. Water is a polar molecule, and they're positive. So you can imagine these are what these little guys are. These are all water molecules, the little Mickey Mouse. So there's the little Mickey Mouse, and I kind of drew this one wrong. But because these are positive ions, here's a positive sodium. Because the polar water molecules are attracted to those polar ions, they tend to carry around this sheath of water that functionally makes them larger than they really are. In other words, to move this sodium ion, we would have to move these water molecules with it. Except this channel, what it does is actually, because of there's oxygen molecules all along here, it strips the water off of these ions and lays them bare of their water. It desheaths them, if you will. That's kind of randy. But anyway, it desheaths them, and the potassium, the ion, then is free to go through the hole. And it's extremely permeable, by the way. These things, the flow through one of these channels is essentially the same as the flow you would see by simple diffusion. In other words, they are extremely permeable to these ions. They don't get in the way of movement at all. And so the potassium ions just come shooting through. These this gate here won't remove the water from the sodium though, and the reason is that sodium hangs on to water much more tightly than potassium does because it's a smaller molecule. Everything's closer to the nucleus, and so it won't strip. And so functionally, these sodium ions are actually bigger than the potassium ions when it goes to actually moving. And that's how they distinguish between the two ions. It's pretty cool. Anyway, oh yeah, if you were at more with poisons, poisons are sexy, let's face it. This is a black mamba. It's, I think, named because of the inside of its mouth is jet black, which is really, I mean, that's a great look. They also have extremely poisonous venom. And as it turns out, the venom of these things actually attacks the potassium channels. And so, again, same thing. It prevents the potassium, I think, let's see, what does it do? It prevents them from functioning, and so potassium won't leave the cell. And so sodium comes in, you get this huge change in membrane potential, just as we saw before, but instead of the potassium channels, causing this to happen, we get the same kind of like this, and yeah, you die. It's a really beautiful snake. Apparently have a reputation for being extremely aggressive, chasing people down. I don't know if it's true or not, but they are incredibly sexy things, and kill a lot of people every year. Not nearly as sexy, but far more common are these chemicals. This is another one. Bifenthrin is, I guess, the trade name. Well, the trade name is Bug Blaster. Bug blasters. God, I went home a few years ago, and my dad had piles of this crap sitting on the shelves in the garage. Dad, what are you doing with this stuff? Oh, we've got beetle larvae. Yeah, the yard guy said we've got beetle larvae or something, and so this is what you put on your, the Scotsman comes by and starts spreading this crap all over your lawn to kill all the insects, which it very much does. And they say not toxic to pets, yada yada yada. My dad probably was pouring it out with his hands. I threw it away when they weren't looking. I tossed. But this works. This stuff, what it does is actually hold sodium channels open. So once they open, this toxin binds to them, and then they can't close. And so again, you get this, and this is what this graph is. So here's voltage on the top one, and this bottom one is the permeability, that is the amount of ion that's moving through these channels in a given period of time. And so here's the sodium channels opening, and the permeability goes way up, and then they close, and the permeability through them goes way down. Here's potassium. Notice that it is a bit more leisurely in its opening and closing. It takes longer to turn on, and that is the voltage has to get a little bit higher before it actually opens. That makes sense. You don't want it to open at exactly the same time as the sodium channel, because then it would cancel each other out. And it comes on a little later, but it also stays on for a bit longer. And so the permeability stays up. This is what results, this is what creates that after polarization. Those potassium channels stay open a little longer. But if the sodium channels don't close, as they're shown to do here, and the permeability goes down, which is what this stuff does, it just permanently depolarizes neurons, and they cease to function. and the insects cease to function. Now, the idea that it only would work on insects, turns out insect sodium channels and our sodium channels are virtually identical, and the effect, they would do the same to your sodium channels.
Dr. Warwick,
Yeah.
I think the reason why pyrethroids are considered non-toxic to mammals is because your liver detoxifies it before it gets to your sodium channels.
Yeah, the point is that mammals have a much higher metabolic rate than insects, and so you probably process it, and it doesn't tend to hang in there very long in your body, and so before it gets to your neurons, we've killed it. That is, if you took enough of this stuff, it's still poisonous. And for I'm not sure what it did to the moles. Not that my dad would have cared if it killed all the moles either, right? But these pyrethroids, I mean, this is a really common bug killing stuff. It's if you want to know where all the bees have gone, it's probably, most of it probably went because of this kind of drug. And you have to wonder, even if you don't like bees, and I'm not sure why you wouldn't, if dispensing this kind of a extremely low common denominator poison is a good idea. It doesn't have a particularly long, it's not particularly stable, it does break down, but still. Anyway, you get the idea that if this action potential, there's a few moving parts here. If any one of them don't work right, the response of the neurons is going to be affected, and the consequences would be catastrophic. So this is just a simple example of, we've stimulated a neuron. These are the little stimulant pulses down here. And notice that the first one, again, we're trying, and this is at the dendritic end. If we stimulated at the dendritic end, you might have gotten this first one was not quite high enough. It didn't reach threshold, so you didn't get the action potential. The second one was a little bigger, and the third one finally reaches threshold, and you get a reaction at the trigger zone. Normally, what happens with an action potential is that they occur at a frequency at which all of them, if you were to measure the absolute change in voltage, such as these down here, they would be essentially exactly the same. And they're frequently referred to as an all or nothing or a uniform response at a membrane. That is, the voltage changes every time, gets up to, whatever it gets to, plus 40 or something. That's true as far as it goes. As it turns out, this is a biochemical, mechanical event. That is, at the level of molecules, there are the mechanics of molecules, the diffusion, the rates of diffusion, the opening and closing of channels. These all take time. And so the fact that they take time has given, and that time that it takes gives rise to an absolute limit of the rate at which these things can fire. Somebody had to give that a name. And so they've given it a name called the refractory period. And what that means is that, okay, while these sodium channels are opening and then closing, and during that period, the potassium channels opening, for while that's happening, that takes a certain length of time, a millisecond or two. So during that time, since they're in the process of doing it, opening and closing, then during that time, you couldn't make them do it again. I have to say that the need to give that period of time a name perplexes me just a tad. That's like saying during the time that it takes for you to change the tire on a car, you couldn't change the tire on a car again. True. Next time you're passing around that pufferfish bong, think about that one. It's, yeah, okay, it takes time, and there's a certain length of time that this event takes, and so you couldn't, that sets an absolute limit on the frequency with which you could do that event. Sure, okay, let's call it the absolute refractory period. Fine, test question, not on my tests. I don't care. The relative refractory period, on the other hand, is this period of time during which, remember, we had this bit of undershoot, which I don't know why they didn't show it on this, this graph, but this period of time during which, if you stimulated the neuron again, as it turns out, the voltage change won't be as great. And the reason is that the resting membrane potential hasn't reestablished quite yet. The sodium potassium pumps are gone. Ah, God, another action potential. They're throwing the sodium ions out, the potassium ions in. And if it's like the analogy that I've heard that I really quite like is something you've probably experienced. You're flushing the toilet before the bowl is full again. So if you're desperate to flush again for some reason, you really want to flush again right away. But if you're not patient and you push the lever too soon and the reservoir hasn't filled, then that extra flush that you were trying to get in is going to be wimpy because not as much water has, that is not as much potential energy has been gathered in the reservoir. And so you're going to get a wimpy flush if you do it too soon. That's what this is. It's a wimpy flush. That is, it's a wimpy action potential. In practice, this is something that you can experimentally produce by stimulating neurons. In practice, does it really mean much for normal functioning neurons? Probably not. But just understand that these events do take time, and there's some absolute limit, and it's an important thing to remember. There's an absolute limit to the frequency with which you can send action potentials. They can only stimulate so hard. And so here's, for example, here we've stimulated a neuron. If this was below threshold, so nothing happened, but here was one that was above threshold. Notice that this one was bigger. Here's the threshold. It was higher than the threshold, and it gave rise, the response of the neuron was to produce 1, 2, 3, 4, how many were there? That's 7 action potentials in some period of time. Notice on this one, the input was a bit higher. That is the graded potential that you use to stimulate. In this case, it's just an electrical shock or something on the neuron. This one was a bit higher, and so this time we get, well, however many that is, 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like 9. So that time we get 9 action potentials, and so on. That is, the response of a neuron, even though the actual voltage of the membrane, change in membrane potential, is exactly the same every time, as long as you've given it enough time through the refractory period, it's the same magnitude, but the frequency of those action potentials is what changes with the change in the graded potential from the input end. That makes sense. If you think about it, okay, so at the input end, we're giving it this much voltage, or we're stimulating it this hard. It's more of a pinprick. With that little pinprick, oh, enough sodium gets in that it gets to the trigger zone, and the trigger zone says, oh, the change in voltage, I'm going to send action potentials. And it sends 6. or 7. But if you hit it with a bigger graded potential at the input end, so now a lot more sodium comes in. With more sodium coming in, it takes longer to diffuse away and get pumped back out, which means the voltage stays above threshold longer, and it's a bigger voltage change at these voltage gated sodium channels. And so more action potentials get sent and more. So this is the way the neurons modulate. They have taken the graded potential, which is a continuum, right? It's a little bit of sodium, a lot of sodium, a whole lot of sodium. It's a continuum of inputs. And you're taking a continuum and you have to turn that into bits. This is an analog to digital converter here. The analog end is this continuum of graded potential that can be anywhere along that continuum. And it has to get digitized, turned into binary information in the form of action potentials. Here we had 7, here we have 9, here we have whatever that is. And that then becomes the encoding of how strong the graded potential was. And that's going to get carried all the way down the axon, the number of action potentials, the frequency of them, and the end of the neuron will respond accordingly. We'll get to that in a little bit. Okay? Any questions about that stuff?
I had a question about the different venoms and poisons we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily want us to memorize like the black mamba venom potassium pumps. You just want us to know like what happens if the potassium pumps aren't running.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just fun facts. You know, in case you ever get bitten by a black mamba, you'll know why you're fading to black.
Like, oh, this is how I go. Got it.
Yeah. Just move toward the light, and you know, it's. I don't think it's always necessarily death there on that one. It's all a matter of how much that stuff you get. You know, if they really latch on and deliver the mother load, then yeah, probably not going to work out.
There's no anti-venom like for this?
Oh,
like
yeah, there is. Yeah, there is for that.
For just the like black mamba, but not the other?
For the pufferfish, I'm pretty sure that I don't know of any. No, but see, you can actually, like, the thing about venoms is they're proteinaceous, and so venom from a snake, this protein, you can create. Antivenoms are frequently essentially antibodies created against those, and so what you do is you get an injection of those, and they can actually bind up and prevent from working any of these venoms that you have in your bloodstream. And because they're proteinaceous, they're big, they take time to work, and they don't go immediately to where they're going to affect neurons. That's just a longer process. And so you're going to have some time. If you had a Playmate cooler with antivenom in it and you shot yourself up with it, you could prevent a lot of it from getting into the places where it causes physiological problems. But yeah, and I'm sure in the countries that black mambas in which they occur, they probably have stocks of such stuff. Certainly, if you're a snake handler, you probably have some in your fridge. But yeah. Anyway, turns out, now this is a really important concept. At this point, we're speaking we've been speaking of neurons as these kind of rote responders. That is, you get a graded potential, and the neuron has no choice. A graded potential of this size will result in this many action potentials out the output end. And we're speaking of neurons as if they're essentially enslaved to their dendritic ends. If they get a stimulus, they're going to have to always respond. Turns out neurons have the ability to modulate themselves and change their response to, say, chronic inputs at their dendritic end. You're experiencing this now. You're experiencing this all the time. If you've ever had, injured yourself or and have a pain that you essentially forget about after a while, that is an example of neuromodulation, the ability to take chronic inputs and essentially have neurons cease to respond to those chronic inputs is neuromodulation. And it happens at the level of the individual neurons themselves. And this is a simple graph of that behavior. So here, this is on this axis is the current intensity, that's the input in. It's just as volts, for example. So let's say this is at A, this is 1 volt, and this would be 3 volts or something like that. And this is over time. And these lines represent, so imagine you're a mad scientist and you're sitting here with a neuron, and you've got a rheostat, which can change voltage gradually, like a dimming light switch. And you're sitting there with the dimming light switch rheostat and you're going, okay, so for this 1E, here you're gradually increasing the current intensity, that is the increasing the voltage rather than the current. You're increasing it very, very, very gradually. Versus at A, it just came on in a square wave. It was more of a light switch. So if you just hit the light switch, throw the third switch, you throw the switch and the voltage goes up to here, the response, that is the threshold of this neuron for that instantaneous response, would be right here. If, on the other hand, you use the rheostat and you were to slowly kind of creep up the voltage and try to kind of sneak up on the threshold, if you will, you would find that the threshold has actually increased a bit. And here's another one. Oh, I'm going even more slowly, increasing the threshold. And now the threshold is all the way up here. And this one's really patient and slow. And it increases the threshold to nearly twice what it was before. And even weirder is if you increase it at a rate below some slope, below some rate, turns out that the neuron will never respond. That is, it always remains below threshold. They diverge. That kind of accommodation, obviously, in nature rarely happens. We're talking about a very artificial, extremely slow input that is so slow that the neuron essentially accommodates without ever hitting a threshold. That would be an extremely rare thing. But these other things probably go on all the time. Guy on YouTube. There's a guy on YouTube for everything.
So essentially what's going on
Here,
with this
hold
graph...
my beer. I'm going to inject myself with Black Mamba. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So essentially what's going on with this graph is as a neuron is more frequently presented with a particular stimulus, it just becomes, what's the word? Desensitized to it?
Well, it's decent. And this doesn't necessarily represent the same neuron.
Okay.
In other words, this is not a change in neuron with different with subsequent stimulations. This is more of you could take completely different neurons and say this one was subjected to a square wave and it was that and its threshold was there. This one, you kind of more slowly subjected it and its threshold went up. This one was subjected even more slowly and its threshold went up further. So these are not sequential events. These are simply different treatments.
Okay, so it's more the speed at which it's more the speed at which the stimulus is presented.
Exactly. And so if you think of
Okay.
it this way, because this slope is very shallow, here the slope is so shallow that the neuron is accommodating to the increase in voltage. If you're familiar with behavioral terms, it's habituating almost. That is, it's accommodating at a rate that's faster than the rate of increase of the stimulus. And so the threshold, which continues to rise, rises faster than the stimulus does. And so it never reaches threshold. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
When does this end up relating to what we were talking about previously about getting more peak action potentials per amount of initial voltage?
In that case, well, I mean, if you're thinking about all of those previous ones, so back this, all of those were all square waves, right? And so this was just on-off switch of different voltages, but just on and off. So if then you did this instead of square wave, annotate, if you did this kind of thing and went, well, I'm not to threshold yet, right? And it turns out that the threshold would be even higher here.
Got it.
Now, and so it would take longer to turn on. But if that's the limit that you got to right there, then you would still get this frequency, right?
Okay, thank you.
So this is more relating to absolute magnitude versus, I better erase that, versus this is relating to, God dang it, clunky piece of crap. This is relating to the speed with which we are introducing the stimulus.
Perfect, thanks.
Just one form of accommodation.
Would you be able to give us an example?
Yeah, we'll see some other examples here in a little bit. Yeah, I mean, you could do this right now to yourself, I think, in the privacy of your own home. You could, let's say if somebody poked you like this, the threshold for the sensation of touch is going to be lower, versus if somebody were to very gradually touch you and very slowly deform the neurons that are detecting touch, then many of the neurons, even if you had the same amount of pressure, so let's just say that I'm going to poke myself and well, maybe with a pin would be better. I don't know.
Like the frog in boiling water.
A what?
Like the frog in boiling water. You start them in cold water.
Oh, God, yeah. The old frog in boiling water. That you gradually turn it up, and if you drop the frog in fast, yeah. Versus gradually turning up the temperature. And the frog constantly habituates to the temperature, and finally it's boiling. Yeah, that's just a grotesque example. I think, it definitely may have be related to accommodation in the frog's sensory neurons. But let's just put it this way: if you could do the same thing with yourself, with temperature, something that if you turned on a hot pad, or if I did this, touch this hot plate here, now that it's fully up to temperature, the threshold of the neurons that detect heat, and some of them react to heat, would be lower than if I turn it off, let it go stone cold, and then turn it on, and as it gradually heated up, I might find that my neurons, my heat sensing neurons, accommodate such that, in particular, the pain neurons accommodate and don't, their threshold increases and changes and changes and changes such that I would find myself more tolerant to the heat if I were to do it that way versus if I just touched it now, it's going to be, I'm going to perceive it as really hot. And I'm not going to do that. I will put my coffee back on. Does that make sense?
It also seemed like it's not just about how slow something happens, but just the strength of the stimulus in general. Because like with your example, a faint touch really isn't much of a stimulus at all.
Well, you know, I was going to go with a very slow touch with the same amount of pressure. And
right.
So
okay.
Case, I was going to say if you.
So this is independent of the strength.
Right.
Of the stimulus. Okay.
Exactly. If I very slowly went in and then finally arrived at the same amount of pressure, I'm not going to perceive that in the same way as if I did that same amount of pressure abruptly. So there's that amount of pressure, I barely feel that, versus going, that's going to bother me. So those are two different phenomena. But yes, strength of stimulus is always going to matter. But the change in threshold, that is the threshold at which a neuron says, ooh, yeah, I detect that. That can actually change. There's a guy on YouTube. Oh, no, it's the same one. Everyone needs a hobby. Okay, yeah. Sticky foot warmers. Oh, what a great story. That's a great, and there was even a note on the packaging to say, don't use these anywhere else.
It said, don't put directly on skin. I thought that was baloney and, don't tell me what to do, and I did it anyway.
Yeah. I told my son not to touch the hot iron. Of course, I was ironing and he's sitting there and I said, that's very hot, don't touch it. Had to do it. Yeah. Anyway, so that's one kind of accommodation. You can change your threshold. Here's another kind of accommodation, and there's two categories. And again, you know how I feel about categories by now. They're crap, all of them. But they're given, these are the ends of the continuum. Again, you have what is called a phasic response, and then there's another one called a tonic response. The phasic response is this. Let's say you have a stimulus down here, and it's this high, whatever that is, voltage-wise. And the response of the neuron is, one action potential, and then it stops. Notice that the resting membrane potential is sitting up here, and that's a result of the voltage change. That as long as that input voltage is keeping up there, then the membrane potential stays that much higher. But notice that it doesn't send, even though it's kind of above threshold, it was above threshold to make it do one, but then it accommodates. In other words, it's changed its threshold in response. It's like, oh, okay. It's just going to sit there, then I'm going to stop responding. I gave you my response, but now I'm not going to go anymore. That's a phasic response. Think phasic, phase on, phase off, and then it doesn't do anything more. That's one extreme example of a phasic response. Versus this, a tonic response is where the neuron would say, okay, here's our stimulus, it's staying on. But in this case, rather than just on and then off, it accommodates in a slightly different way in that it simply starts to reduce the number of action potentials rather than simply turn them off. So that's a tonic response. In reality, and so the question, of course, well, how do you get these two different types of response from neurons? And it can be due to, as it turns out, the introduction of calcium into the cell. There are a lot of ways that you can change the responsiveness of neurons. For example, and a lot of them are mediated by calcium. Some of them are mediated by simple mechanical properties. So you can change the mechanical properties of the dendrite such that it exhibits this kind of accommodation versus this kind of response. Other ways, chemical ways, is if, say, calcium enters the cell. Turns out calcium changes the responsiveness of sodium channels. It actually dampens the response of sodium channels, more calcium. Conversely, if you lack calcium, your sodium channels get super responsive and they tend to be more porous. But more calcium, they tend to be less responsive. So there's all kinds of, that's just one example. If you want to, there's a condition, hypocalcemia, where you lost so much calcium, and it happens with lactating mammals. They get, they call it milk fever, I think, where so you got a mother dog who has just, given birth to 10 puppies, and they're all at the teat, suckling away all of her energy and, as it turns out, a lot of calcium. And while they're suckling, their blood calcium levels can get so low if they're not, getting proper nutrition. Their blood calcium levels get so low that their muscles start to go into spasms, and it's because with the calcium levels so low, their sodium channels have gotten hyper responsive. That is, their voltage, their threshold voltage, has been driven down. And so the slightest input at the dendritic end results in action potentials. And so their muscles start shaking. They can get actually muscle spasms. It can kill them. Proper calcium levels are critically important. If they go bad, a lot of stuff goes bad quick. But that's just one way, that one mechanism for changing the responsiveness of neurons. And again, this tonic and phasic response, here's a real live example of, these are cardiac neurons, and wow, that's a really good phasic response, and wow, that's a pretty cool tonic response. And so there are neurons that are very classic in their response at the end of the continuum. Most neurons, it's going to be something that's a little bit messier looking than that. So here's one that, here's more of a phasic E kind of response, and this is a more tonic E type. But notice that we didn't just get one here. We got however many that is, and it went from 6 down to 4, and then it stopped. So you get the idea. So a bit more on how these action potentials propagate. So we're going to send action potentials in response to graded potentials, and we're going to send them at some rate, and we need to get them down, sometimes the axons of neurons that are meters and meters in length. These, again, are molecular events that have to somehow translate into macroscopic events, macroscopic communications. You can have single neurons inside of a blue whale that I'm not even sure how long they are, but certainly tens of meters is not out of the question. How do we get those molecular events to translate into very macroscopic changes in membrane potential? Well, the best way to think about this is the same way we think about any kind of electrical event. Good old V equals IR, voltage, which is potential electrical energy, current, which is the flow of the charge, and the resistance that impedes the flow. Now, in the case of neurons, rather than electrons, which is what we're thinking about with electricity, we're going to be thinking about cations, which don't flow like electrons, which is essentially almost pure energy. We're thinking about flowing. Here we're talking about actual movement of ions. But in principle, the changes in voltage that result in this movement can be viewed in exactly the same way. So remember, V equals IR, and then current is going to be V divided by R. In other words, the more voltage you have, given the same amount of resistance, the more current movement you will have. Likewise, the more current you have means more voltage, or if you have less current, that means you have lots of resistance. So let's think about these structures in terms of V equals IR. I guess the last thing I'll get to say is that a V we've always been looking at, that's going to be somewhere between minus 70 and minus 90, depending on the tissue, depending on the cell. And resistance, R, is proportional to the inverse of axon diameter, or inversely proportional to axon diameter. That is, the bigger the axon cross section here, the bigger that diameter, the less resistance it's going to have. That's exactly the same as if we were thinking about electricity and wires. The bigger the wire, the less resistance it has, which is why if you have really high voltage going somewhere, you have to have really big wires, which will have low resistance to carry all that current. Otherwise, they get hot and they melt. Likewise, the bigger the axon diameter, the easier it is for things to flow along that long axis of that axon. Makes sense. If you had a little tiny axon, then it's going to be an impediment to the movement of ions. And ultimately, we need to consider the movement of ions. They're not moving far, but they do have to move. And axon diameter is going to be very important when it comes to the flow. And we have the same players there. Our voltage-gated sodium channels that we'll see all the way down the axon. And I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, you want to stick around right now, that's fine. Otherwise, you can save them for recitation. We'll see you at 4 o'clock for recitation. Yeah, it does happen with dairy cows. Yeah, they get. Isn't it called milk fever? Isn't that what they call it? I'm trying to remember something.
Yeah, it's called milk fever.
Milk fever, yeah.
And essentially essentially the principle of milk fever was you're losing so much calcium, your muscles just don't work like they should.
Well, you're losing so much calcium that your sodium channels on your neurons as well as your muscles become, the threshold actually lowers. The voltage threshold actually lowers, and they become more responsive. They tend to stay open longer, and so that means you become hyper reactive in terms of your action potentials in both your muscles and your neurons. And so you end up, in tetanic contractions or shaking and so on.
Okay.
You might have already said this, but does the diameter of the axon have any impact on the speed of the signal?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and by the way, Amanda, I think I need to talk to you. Did you not get my email?
I didn't see one. I can double check though.
Yeah, why don't you hang after class? I need to talk to you.
Okay.
Yes, I mean the diameter, the bigger the diameter, the more flow that there's going to be.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Name?
So it'll go faster if the diameter is bigger?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep.
What was the name of the milk fever? What was the other name for it?
Well, the problem is hypocalcemia.
Oh, okay.
That is low blood calcium. Is
Got it.
the ultimate. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep.
Myelinated sheaths